So most of the photographs on frequency started when the pandemic hit. Every day I was seeing the same things. There was a certain repetition. There was a certain tension in the environment, but also like, again, with the anxiety and everything that I was kind of seeing from other people. And I call it frequency because of that kind of notion of, repetition in terms of what I was seeing, the conversations that I was having, everything that was happening, that it felt like that was never going to end. But also my own kind of process, going out for long walks, coming back, processing film, scanning film, next day, same thing. Without necessarily seeing results right away, but that started to build up. And then I started to kind of print and see certain connections.
Welcome to the show, Christian.
Thank you. Great to be here. Pleasure to be talking to you.
Glad to have you. For those that don't know you, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience.
My name is Cristian Ordóñez, originally from Chile. I've been living in Canada for almost 15 years, since 2008, that I moved here initially for 3 years. It's been already 15. I came here with my family. I do photography. Originally, I'm a graphic designer by practice. Didn't study photography, but I've been doing photography for a lot of years now. Yep.
You're a wonderful photographer, and you can see
Thanks.
your graphic design. Do you do your own books? Do you do the edit and arrangement and all that stuff? Okay. Because they're wonderful. They look really good. I guess my first question is I always like to dive deep and kind of find out where an artist is from and kind of where they originated and stuff like that. So kind of give me a little background before you became a photographer.
Of course. I think I'm going to go back to before that. I was born in Santiago in Chile in 1976. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Chile was under dictatorship for 17 years, from 73 to 1990, under Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. And it was a terrible period. Some periods better than others, but throughout very, very bad. With a lot of death and torture people, disappearance, etc. However, there's kind of two parts to that story that kind of affected certain things around my life. My parents never got involved in politics that much. So, and if you didn't get involved in politics and basically, play along with what was happening, try to live your life. Put in a way, you had a decent life with all the kind of challenges of living in a dictatorship. Curfews, everything that was happening in the streets, seeing people being detained, etc., etc. So there was obviously a lot of limitations and bad things happening constantly. But if you didn't get involved in politics and you play by the rules, to put it in a way, you had a more or less fine life. You
flew under the radar. Yeah.
You exactly. You flew under the radar. That's maybe put it. But again, curfews. I grew up with curfews, and things like my parents telling me you can't go into the garden or don't look under the blinds because you could see tanks 2 blocks from your house. My living room had a look into a street that was looking directly into a main avenue. So there was this main avenue, my street, and at the end of that street was my house, right in the middle. So if I look through my living room, I had a view towards the avenue, and I could see sometimes tanks goes by or the police, etc. And maybe I was too little, but my brother, talking to my brother years after, he telling me that he saw, for instance, people being detained in the street outside of our house and things like that. So that affected a lot of things. But as a kid, sometimes you don't really realize what's going on if your parents are not necessarily kind of talking about it, right? I think I became more aware of what was happening maybe when I was around 8 or so. We had family living in Peru that moved there for work, I think in the 60s or so. And one of my cousins was working on the Peruvian television, national television. And we went, I think on 85, we went to visit them. And they show us some kind of documentaries of what happened in 1973 that were like prohibited to be broadcasted live in Chilean national television. So and this was mostly like documentaries done by like European journalists and filmmakers. So that kind of opened my eyes to what was happening in my country that I wasn't seeing, as a kid. And afterwards I realized that, and I think it was on 87, that Chileans that were kicked out of the country in 1973 were able to return. The government, for the first time, allowed them to return to the country. And one of my mom's brother, I knew that we had family in New Zealand, living in New Zealand. But one of my uncle actually left the country because he was a communist going to protest, and he was captured and tortured. Thankfully, he was let go, and he went to Peru, and then from Peru, he ended up being in New Zealand. So I have extended family now in New Zealand with people, family that cousins that were born there, that were married to other Kiwis, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's been around over 40 years, 50 years, of family there. And long story short, that's how I ended up afterwards in New Zealand. Through my uncle that, in a way kind of invited my parents to go there. My parents basically quit their jobs. We rented our house, and they said, okay, let's just go and try. And we moved to New Zealand. And that affected a lot of the way kind of I see the world, the things that I've done afterwards. It basically also opened my eyes, going from, a dictatorship in the 80s in South America and arriving in New Zealand. It was a paradise, from how people live to the amount of nature that obviously, New Zealand has, to arriving in a school that was completely different from my high school in Chile, that was a Catholic high school run by French Canadian priests. So that affected a lot of my personal vision. I started in New Zealand. I started to get involved in skateboarding because my high school had a skate park. I got involved in listening to independent music and punk rock and discover all of that. And I started painting. And that was when I was 11. Through classes, of like visual arts in the school that we had that were very, very progressive from my point of view, coming from from Chile. Maybe it was a common thing in other countries, but for me it was very, very eye-opening.
How old were you?
I arrived in New Zealand when I was 11.
11, okay.
It was young, but it's kind of your early teenage years, so it kind of dictates certain decisions that you made afterwards.
Yeah, for sure.
It also dictates your taste. Like what I was mentioning to you, like for instance, music and being involved in arts, or getting interested in arts more than being involved. But also like skateboarding, like all of those three elements in my life became very important. Like for instance, skateboarding. I started skateboarding when I was 11. I stopped skating a couple of years ago. basically because of my niece, so that became part of my life throughout. And with that, arts is a big part of it, the subculture, the, punk rock.
Alternative lifestyle. Yeah, that's what they called it.
The DIY aspect of doing things and pushing for something, and very important in the way I see things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. You have to kind of play, with the market, with different things. But that way of looking into things, I think, became important for me. And then when we went back to Chile, Pinochet wasn't in the government anymore. Democracy came back. We had so culture-wise, it felt like Chile was kind of flourishing. Like everything was new, culture was coming, bands were going there to play, that were banned to enter the country before. Everyone was playing music or making bands. It was kind of also the 90s. So it was like a lot of alternative music was kind of the main music, that was playing in the radio. So even that part was kind of very important in local culture, and how obviously, European, North American music was influencing what was happening in the country.
How old were you then when you went back?
Early 14.
So you spent 3 years in New Zealand.
Yeah, around 2 years.
3 or 4.
Yeah, no, 2 years around there.
Okay.
So that definitely it was.
You're influenced. You're changed, and you go back, and you're like, "Huh, interesting." Yeah.
And that I think my first photos were, which is nothing important, but when I was 11, using these disposable cameras and taking photos of my friends before going to New Zealand. And in New Zealand, I didn't take photos. But I remember that buying these disposable cameras and being around with my friends, taking photos of them because I was leaving. And I remember one photograph that I took from like Santiago, from the airplane that I have like printed somewhere with a disposable camera. But in New Zealand, I was basically painting and drawing a lot. And when I go back to Chile, it's the same thing. I a lot of painting, drawings. I remember I had like murals in my bedroom, and like ripping apart like skateboarding magazines or music magazines and doing collages in my bedroom and kind of working with that language, which I think it was very common for that era. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I was always kind of working with these kind of visual elements to create something else.
Magazines were everywhere, and we used to cut them all up. And I remember that. That was the way we experienced the world in a lot of ways. See other places, and I remember National Geographics were like transporting to another world. I just remember those. Yeah, I know what you mean. It was very much a part of the culture then.
And I was, like music was arriving into Santiago, to Chile. But for instance, I remember we had 2 like record stores that were bringing in music, like independent music. And one of the things that they did was basically record tapes for you if you couldn't buy, the CDs, for instance, So it was kind of a, not a legal thing, but it became legal there because that was the only way to, spread, the music. And that's how everything started. So I even I remember buying blank t-shirts and, drawing the band's names with their logos, like Dead Can Dance or, whatever that was. So instead of buying t-shirts because I couldn't afford them, I was wearing t-shirts that were painted by me with the logos of the bands, so everything was very DIY. And years after, I moved to live to Miami briefly, which I hated it. I didn't like Miami. And maybe it was because the culture, but also like a period of my life that I didn't really want to leave Chile. But I had my green card for the States and everything. I just didn't like it, and I went back to Chile afterwards. And I wanted to study visual arts, which I didn't have enough, school credits to go into the university that I wanted to. Ended up going to graphic design. Which is something that I didn't necessarily like at the beginning. And I remember that in third year, I wanted to quit, but sorry, let me start. I didn't really like at the beginning, but when I was studying graphic design, I also had like photography classes and that's where I learned how to use, the darkroom, and explore with photography, but use photography as a way to, basically create observations of the environment. I wasn't kind of creating serious or being critical. It was just another kind of contemporary medium that I was using. But what I was going to say is that in my third year of graphic design, I wanted to, quit the career. I didn't like it. I wasn't having fun. I remember a teacher came with two books that became very important for me in that era. One was from a designer called David Carson from the States. And he used to be the art director for magazines like Reagan, but also like Surfer Magazine and Transworld Skateboarding, I think, at some point. So like I realized through that book that everything that I was consuming before was related to graphic design. But when you in your first years of graphic design, at least in the program that I was in, everything was very corporate. That I wasn't getting too interested in. So through that book, I understood that my influences were related to that, which is something that I never made the connection before until that point. And he also showed me another book from a collective called Tomato from London, and they were very interesting because some of the members were from that collective were from the band Underworld. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the band. The guys that did, for instance, the music for Transpointing,
okay,
film, electronic music,
okay.
and but the interesting thing about them is that it was a graphic design studio. It was a creative studio, but they were working with poetry and photography and experimental processes and film and traditional graphic design. And I understood as well that, kind of how flexible graphic design was and how you could use different mediums to communicate something or play with it. And it wasn't necessarily just doing a logo and a branding identity, and that's when I started to fall in love again with graphic design. And my thesis was related to images and typography in relationship to music and graphic design. So I ended up kind of mixing all those elements within my thesis as well.
Wow.
Yeah, but going back to photography, through this same teacher that showed me these books, we ended up going for walks or with other classmates on Saturday mornings just to take photographs of the city. And those early photographs were all like 35 millimeters, and it was basically just observations of architecture or vernacular typography, things that the grids of architecture or the different kind of views of architecture. But back then, I wasn't necessarily thinking about, this is architecture, and this is a grid, and this is how this relates to design, or how, we live in a city. It was just, pure reaction to my environment, nothing kind of critical. But I think that's how it started, yeah.
Where did you go to school? Where were you going to school? at that time?
It's an institute, part of the Catholic University of Chile in Santiago.
Okay.
Yep.
So you were going to school there, and I just love that you were talking about music and stuff, and that I'm kind of curious. Who was your favorite bands back then?
Oh, way too many.
Way too many. Yeah, there had to have been one repeat. I'm curious.
I'm gonna tell you maybe 4 bands.
Okay,
that's okay. Just because of the different kind of styles of music, The Cure is basically one of them.
Of course,
the early The Cure,
of course, naturally.
My Bloody Valentine maybe is another one, or Cocteau Twins. Okay. But also like bands like Bad Religion was very important for me, or Descendants, from kind of the skateboarding punk, world, or Black Flag. And there's
Black Flag. Yeah. It's great.
But there's also bands like that became very important for me, and they're still very important for me, like Los Jaivas, which is a progress folk band from Chile, but they were kicked out of the country, and they spent many times in France before going back. So their music is very, very progressive. They call them like the Pink Floyd of Latin America, and they always say that when somebody hears them, like critics, they always say like if this man was born somewhere else, they were probably known worldwide. They're very
Floyd. The Pink Floyd. Okay, wow, that's a great comparison. That's
yeah.
That band is iconic. What's that?
I can send you some information.
And I'm sure our comments are going to light up if they know who it is, and you might want to share it when your episode comes out in the comments. I'll probably ask you. Maybe I will.
They have a really good song that was recorded in Machu Picchu, and it's the only band that has been allowed to upload even a piano to Machu Picchu, and this was in the 70s or 60s.
Wow.
Now
it's pretty much gated up. You can't get into. They're trying to protect it. That's amazing. Wow.
Pink Floyd is also very important for me. Yeah.
So, I always like to ask this question because you're now pretty much photographer, and you share your work through photography, and there's this moment for people, that switches when you realize that I am a photographer and this is what I want to do. What was that moment for you?
Well, I'm still a graphic designer. That's why I earn my living. But yes, I think of photography and I look at photography every day. And even though I didn't study, photography, I feel as a photographer in that sense. And even my graphic design practice, I do commercial work as well. In the last few years, have been also kind of moving towards, kind of the photography aspect. When did I realize? That's a good question.
I know they're really extremely closely connected. When I did my bachelor's of fine art, I actually did a graphic design it was like a dual course thing, and I loved it. I did the painting and I made all the different things. It was amazing. But they're very closely linked because you're using images to communicate ideas. Then you do it through text, and so. But there, you're putting together work in a way that you're communicating purely photographically. And so I was curious that part.
The photography became more serious for me when I moved to Canada, and there's a few reasons. I have 3 kids who were young parents, and I have a daughter that is 23, and I have a couple of identical twins boys that are 19. And Carolina is my wife. We had a design studio in Chile, and when I became 30, we kind of realized that, okay, this is more or less stable. Like if we stay here, we kind of know how your life is gonna go. And And how I was mentioning before, living in New Zealand was very influential for me. I always wanted, my kids to have the experience of living somewhere else. So we decided to, travel. And one of the places that we decided to come was, to Canada. And when I came to Canada for the first time in 2007, I had interviews with design studios just to see if I could get work, or projects or something. Long story short, the year after, I was hired by a company, and that company brought me here as an art director. And initially, I came for 3 years. It's been more than 15 years. I'm no longer with the company anymore. I was with the company for a couple of years. But moving here to kind of a new environment, a new way of working, because it was the first time for me to start working full-time, for other people. But also trying to understand, how my family and my kids were evolving, getting used to the new environment was very important for me. And this way that I was working, full-time in a design studio with briefs and with a structure and, 9 to 5, sometimes longer, depending on your position, things like that, was different because in Chile I was mostly work. I had my studio in my house. It was an extension of my house that we built. So my time was allocated based on how I wanted to, arrange that time. And the structure that I gave to my life was a balance between work and, family, friends, of my own time. So I came to Canada and I bought my firms. I think I bought a Lomo first, and then I bought a Mamiya, a medium format Mamiya 645. And I started basically just wander around and understand kind of the territory where I was living, and documenting my kids as well. That's more of a kind of an exercise. But that allowed me to kind of understand my environment, get used to it, but also see from my point of view record how my kids were evolving. 3 kids, 3 different personalities, everything being new. And I think that was important for me, but also in terms of process, removing myself from the structure of working full-time in a design studio and the structure of working with clients and briefs, and allowing photography to be just my own language and just myself with film, with a slower process, and, using, the process of walking as kind of my main tool in a way to move along the environment. Allow myself to kind of have a better balance, of life, in terms of creative outcome. So I don't think I was very successful at the beginning, which is part of the process, in terms of the images that I was making. But I think that became very important in how my photo has been evolving, and also to understand, the things that I wanted to do, which is something that I'm still understanding, but over time, it became kind of a almost daily practice.
Yeah. And I know when you start to do photography, especially when you're in that kind of that corporate kind of world, they're very separate than fine art. And so was there someone that was influential on you that kind of pulled you in that direction?
No, to be honest, I didn't know much of I wasn't buying photo books back then. I wasn't really aware much about like the contemporary photo world. I had friends here that they were also graphic designers, and they were using kind of film to take photographs. Back then Instagram wasn't around. It was Flickr, and so sharing through Flickr was a way to build certain community. But I wasn't very involved. I always had my website, and I always kind of put stuff on my website and try to share. So some things happened here and there, but somehow it was always a connection through design. And why I say that is because, I don't know, sometimes I knew an art director that created a magazine, and it was a magazine about lifestyle where like photography or art or design was part of it. And they made a feature of my photographs with my kids, here in Canada, so it was kind of more the using photography, but the view as a father. And that was printed in a couple of magazines, things like that. But slowly, I think I started to discover more things, mostly through internet. And it evolved through that, like with local people, because how it happens everywhere. I was new to the city. I didn't go to a photography university here. So everyone that was doing that I started to discover after or meet after, every photographer, local photographer, they had their crew. And to get involved in that was kind of hard. One of the things that helped me, though, is that there's a good photography center here in Toronto that you could be a member. That is called Gallery 44. And that is run by artists, photographers, and it has a facility, where you can print. You have a dark room. It has, a studio space. It has an Imacom that you can go and scan. But it also has, a residence, and it has a gallery space in the second floor. And that somehow I became a member of that space. At some point, I was kind of part of a committee for special events in that from that gallery. But somehow, like instances like that allowed me to start to meet people or get involved somehow in kind of group exhibitions and things like that. And I think that also kind of started to open my world a little bit more locally.
So Gallery 44 was influential on you. So what was that first project where you started to think conceptually? Because now you're kind of, you're jumping in,
Well, I did my first book on 2017. And sometimes I think that I did it way too early.
Never too early.
I'm proud of the book. Not necessarily like all the photographs now, but I think that's very common with everything that wasn't do. It might happen to many of us. I have this book a small book called Other Voices, that speaks about the land and territory and how the land in a way kind of hides memory. And I say that because I remember, for work traveling to the West Coast, California or Vancouver, just the West Coast area. And when the first times that I arrived there for work, I always try to, tell my product managers, like, leave me an extra day because I want to go and take photographs or, so I travel sometimes for one meeting, and I always had like an extra day where I rented a car and just went somewhere, went to a national forest or to the coast, etc. And every time that I was there, there were like smells from plants or just the sea, the Pacific Ocean or the mountains that brought me back either to Chile or either to New Zealand. Something that doesn't happen here because I live, surrounded by big lakes. I live in the big lakes area, but we don't have mountains. We don't have like forests. We don't have sea. And I grew up, by the Pacific in Chile, an hour away from the Pacific, by the Andes, the Andes being right there in Santiago, and also in New Zealand. I lived in Christchurch, where I was by the water and by the mountains, also the Pacific. So there was a sense of a smell that brought me back memories from my childhood, and I think that kind of triggered the idea of working with Other Voices, which is that book that I don't even think it's in my website anymore. But working with like memory and working with nature and how those things kind of collide was one of the first projects that I started to think a little bit more conceptually, always based on my own kind of personal experience.
Sure.
But I think I was trying to kind of to narrow it down into a more specific project.
Are all of your projects personal too, do you think?
More or less. Valle is not necessarily personal. It is personal because it's Chile. It's a project from Chile, but I'm not from that specific area.
Sure.
But so that one maybe is not personal. No, not every project is personal. Not every project is personal. I try to bring my own, personal interpretation and subjective interpretation, because I don't believe I'm not doing documentary work necessarily. Yeah. I'm kind of borrowing from the documentary practice, I think, but I think everything has, and I wanted to have my own kind of interpretation or subjective or objective, point of view. And I also like that people have their own interpretation to the work. I like those tensions that sometimes brings. And I love it when, I speak to somebody and they say like, oh, I see this in this project and I never saw that, and that just triggers something that I wasn't seeing. So I like that about art in general. Which for me, there's a difference between like documentary photography to a more like an author point of view or an artistic point of view. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to see the next project that we're going to jump right into is a winner of the Urbanaut Awards in 2020 called Frequency. And I want to jump into that, and I'll ask this question before we jump into it. Why pick the name Frequency? What does that mean to you? Why is that the title?
So most of the photographs on Frequency started when the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And I think in 2019, I did a project called On Trial that it was kind of an evolution from a project that maybe started in 2016 or 15. And that's when I started to bring back black and white photography into my practice. And I say bring back because I was doing it before, but I never kind of got into it. There was something in it that maybe I wasn't doing it right. I'm not even sure if I'm doing it right at the moment, but and I when the pandemic hit, here in Canada we had the flexibility, to move around, not in groups, but with your household, but you can still like go out, and I'm lucky enough to be living, a kilometer away from the Lake Ontario, but I'm also in between a river that goes to Lake Ontario that has creek and forest, and one of the big parks of Toronto, which is called High Park, that also have like ponds and forest. So I'm kind of in between a lot of nature. And when the pandemic hit, I had film in my fridge. I bought chemicals. All the labs were closed, so I couldn't kind of process film. I bought chemicals. I bought that enlarger that I have here in the back. And I started to go for walks as just to ease yourself with everything that was happening. My parents are in Chile. My brothers are away here in Canada in another place. My wife's family is back in Chile as well. I was seeing a lot of anxiety in their environment, in my own household, but also with friends. People wanted to move away from the city. A lot of anxiety, like for everything that was happening, that it was a common thing throughout the world.
Yeah.
And the only way to kind of release that anxiety or being able to balance it somehow was going out for walks. And that was also because like my commercial work stopped, for a few months. So we ended up like going for walks, me and Carolina, most of the time, for like 2 or 3 hours, mostly around my environment. And the only way to kind of keep myself busy was coming back, processing film right away, sometimes like 4 rolls, 5 rolls, and scanning them right away. And sometimes like use a larger tool. Here, this space is the basement of my house, and it's my full studio. So this becomes a dark room, like turn off the lights, change the mood. It becomes a dark room sometimes, and it's also my design office or it's kind of a mixed space. And this is where I was most of the time, or walking. And every day that was a constant thing. Every day I was seeing the same things. There was a certain repetition. There was a certain tension in the environment, but also again, with the anxiety and everything that was kind of seen from other people. And I call it frequency because of that kind of notion of, repetition in terms of what I was seeing, the conversations that I was having, everything that was happening, that it felt like that was never going to end. But also my own kind of process, going out for long walks, coming back, processing film, scanning film, next day, it's the same thing. Without necessarily seeing results right away, but that started to build up. And then I started to kind of print and see certain connections. So for me, it became kind of obvious that frequency or something around those lines was the name, because I felt that kind of it groups all these elements that were important in terms of kind of the building of the project. And the project itself speaks about, the tension and the conflicts that people were having about, how we live, what was happening, the way we build a certain, architecture or urban environment or system on the way that we live, that becomes kind of repetitive. And when things like this happen, we feel kind of very vulnerable. Going from the urban environment into nature and seeing how nature, kind of reheals itself without necessarily having a patch, and we are kind of patching our houses, patching the streets, adding something that becomes not necessarily permanent, but with then, if there's a hole in the sidewalk, we need to patch it, and then that hole is gonna stay there for 5 years, and then we need to do it again, or turn it apart and do it all over again to make it livable for us, within our system. And nature heals itself, no matter what, it just heals itself. So going into nature became kind of this escape from that kind of tension, that kind of conflict that was happening in the environment. And I think what I try to do with frequency is kind of allow those images to communicate that sensibility. But that's how kind of the name came about.
All right, let's take a look. Let's take a look at those images, and let's. You did a great job setting it up. So this is a selection of images from frequency. The amount of work that I made was I think it was around 600, 700 photographs, which obviously not all of them are good. But I also have something in my head that, there's a reason why you take images, and I try to basically scan everything high res. So I have a very big archive of work, and I go back to the images, and sometimes they become something else, or they trigger another idea or things like that, even if it's a not good image. But obviously the book has a selection of images. They're not all of them here on my website, but they're all black and white. And one of the reasons is what I was saying before, I'm only developing black and white photographs in my space, and everything was closed in terms of labs. So that became kind of a limitation that I put into my process. And that also helped to, I guess, create a certain language. What I was focusing was empty spaces, tension within architecture. But again, empty spaces is kind of also strange to say, because most of the spaces were empty in the streets, no matter what. But throughout the pandemic, but it was kind of strange. Yeah, it was weird.
Blocked doors. or traces of human intervention, or traces of different kinds in architecture, or in concrete or in walls. Everything that in a way create a certain tension or spoke about this conflict of how we live. But also, like, sometimes animals that were in the street, that were all the things that was seen in the streets, but somehow they were taking over the spaces that were empty. Like what you see here in this image, that is the entrance of a store space that was closed for a long time. And again, this idea of patches and how we have to kind of heal or try to heal our own architecture to be able to live. And here you'll see, bricks over bricks in a wall, that are kind of falling apart. So you see a little bit of memory here. You see history, but you also understand how we are repurposing our own architecture to make it, feasible for us to live. And there's certain, obviously, repetition in certain pictures, and I like that idea of repetition, which speaks to about this idea of frequency that you can see maybe more in the book rather than selection of images that are here, that I worked as diptychs in the book, or images like this, that speak about this relationship between nature and architecture, but also how unfriendly sometimes architecture becomes, visually, but also, like this space that you see here that is very, brutalist, and a lot of concrete, not big windows, so there's not a lot of light, and how that tension speaks to itself, or kind of the dialogue between the two elements in nature and those. And that kind of architecture, or abandoned spaces.
I'm going to jump in. You were talking about the black and white, using black and white, and you said you don't even know if you do it right. It's kind of a change. To me, I think you're doing it great. What was challenging for you? Why do you feel like that? Why do you feel like it's different? I'm curious.
From color, you mean?
Yeah.
I think making it more homogeneous in terms of language from image to image. Some images, they have more contrast than others. Depends on the light. If it's a cloudy day, if it's a sunny day, etc. But I think I started to focus on the essence of the image, or what I was looking at, rather than, being caught up with this image is way too saturated, or, the colors here were too bright, or, and just those aspects became somehow, it's funny because they became somehow more, I don't want to say fake or false, because the reality is color. It's no, we don't see things black and white, but, I don't know. It's hard to say, to be honest. It's hard for me to explain it. There's something about this. And don't get me wrong, I love color, and lately I've been just looking at color images back again. But it's not that I don't like black and white anymore. It's just, it comes and goes. It also depends on the project that
I would agree with you.
I think I work in both languages, but this one maybe was also kind of the dance of the environment that within those years that communicated better through black and white. But I was also being honest, with the limitations that I was having within my process. And just going back to this idea of the pandemic, like I keep on mentioning the pandemic because most of the pictures were made within those years. But for me, this project is not necessarily about the pandemic. It's not about COVID. It was made during that era. It was made and it was inspired maybe by the sensation of what maybe we realized about how we were living. But I think that aspect has always been there. We became more aware of how we live in the period of time, and I think it speaks more towards that rather than this idea of COVID. I don't know if that makes sense, but going back to your question, I'm not really sure if I can really understand honestly kind of the difference for me between color or black and white.
I think to you, what I was really kind of driving is sometimes a color image has a different feeling for me when I look at it than a black and white one does, and often I'll look at an image and go, that I love the highlights and the shadows, and I think that would be way better as a black and white, just aesthetically, but also it invokes a different feeling. And you tapped into it a little bit. You tapped in. You eliminate the color and you kind of get right to the subject, and it's that's a good point. And living in those limitations, you kind of have this as your way of making, and so. It also kind of talks about the stripped away nature. There's so much buried in there. It's so good.
Yeah. But I'm also like, with going back to graphic design, with graphic design, you use so many tools and you use the computer a lot, and allow myself to, make an image black and white if I wanted to. With my photography, I use my limitations. I use, for instance, 2 cameras, one large format with one lens and one medium format with one lens. I don't change the lens. I use 2 types of film. I might change because of the price right now, but I was using, Kodak Portra 400, and I was using Kodak Tri-X 400. And I never, transform a color image into a black and white. If that photograph doesn't work for me in color, it's not necessary that I'm gonna go back and take that photograph again with a black and white film. I just don't do it, and it just doesn't work, and I normally, for the most part, I take one photograph, like this scene that we're looking at here. I just took one photograph and I continue walking. So and that became part of my practice. There's certain photographs, that I might think, okay, I might take like 2 photographs of this from different points of view, different angles, but there's a purpose there. I don't take, this specific, image twice to see which one will work better. And I think I don't question that anymore. It just became kind of a purpose within my own practice. And so those kind of limitations between kind of the cameras that I use to the film that I use to taking just one photograph, is part of the honesty within my own process that I kind of like, and I kind of got used to it. And I say like this with complete transparency. Like sometimes I might not be, too. I might have photographs that are terrible in terms of composition, in terms of light, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that honesty, and there's very few times where I take a photograph and maybe the results I'm not 100% happy with, and I go back another day with a better light or to take the photograph again. I think I can count with my hands, the amount of times throughout the years that I've done that. So going back to this idea of like color, black and white, I'm also like being honest with that. Like sometimes it just works for me, and I don't think I have a deeper, explanation of why that is. Sometimes I might get bored of color and I try black and white. Sometimes I get bored of black and white and I might try color, and it's no more deeper than that. And in this case, it became this because of the limitations of labs being closed. I didn't even try to process color, and it was easier and faster to process black and white. It was, the chemicals that I was able to afford. And even though my larger can print color, I haven't tried it yet. I've just done black and white. When I enlarge photographs in with that machine. So I was kind of using those limitations, and I was fine with that. I just continued with the process, and I made that process work. Again, that doesn't mean that I can try something else, a year from now. But yeah, I mean, forms, alternations within the architecture and that kind of relationship with the environment or nature, in a way, and just sometimes images that were abstract enough to make you think, emptiness, or images that might have like different connotation or different kind of interpretation. But I also I don't necessarily like to explain each one of the images. And I think every time that my images are most of the time numbered or called untitled, because I like also the viewer to have their own interpretation into the image rather than me writing a caption and having a description of the image. There's images like this one that that speak about this idea of patches and blocking things, but they're also they're beautiful, and it even becomes more like a sculptural aspect to it within architecture or the way that we live, and there's things that I randomly found in my walks that might speak directly into, the text that, for instance, Monica wrote about, that was nurtured from conversations that I had with her, the same way that we're having this conversation about the work. And she did a really good job in kind of writing about it and describing kind of maybe what I was feeling. Probably a better job than what I would do. But more or less is that, or again, just, escaping into nature, that, forests and how forests are also intervened by human, they have human intervention, but they heal themselves, or they adapt themselves to the environment, in weird ways like this, that I have no idea why this happened, but, this speaks about this idea of adaptation, and how nature adapts itself by itself with no, even if we put, a building next to it, they might go around the building and just, looking for light, and just, just by that action, they allow themselves to live, so things like that are the things that I was looking at, looking at houses, how we live, the way that we structure our places, and how nature becomes part of that. Obviously, this is a reflection of my environment here. I know that, not every house around the world is like this, in terms of space, in terms of how we live, in terms of, the size of the house, etc. But it's a reflection. Another photograph that speaks about this idea of, adaptation. But what I like about this photograph that I think is very obvious is this kind of relationship to human or to touching, or that it was kind of forbidden within that period, but somehow we felt more, in terms of kind of the human interaction, we felt more connected, even though we were not connected, and I say that because maybe I was speaking more deeply with my friends, and speaking about feelings, and speaking about, with my family, or speaking about, what was worrying each other. And that was reflected, in the way that we were living, in the way that, and the things that were happening. And, seeing details like this, how also trees communicate within each other. And again, they heal themselves and they allow themselves to live, or, I believe within the roots, they communicate each other, they share nutrients, this image spoke to that somehow.
I can't help but get a sense of this word "do it yourself," that you talked about in your younger years. It's almost like you're finding that do it yourself resourcefulness. You're still looking for it, and that's what draws your eyes. I can't help but think about that. I guess it was a garage door, that makeshift garage door with all these iron gates, And it seems like you're kind of being drawn to stuff like that. Would you agree with that, or do you think I'm just kind of looking too far into it?
No, I think I am. And with that, to vernacular or empty spaces or things I've been kind of rethought of. I'm always drawn into that, and I might have a selection of images that don't belong to anything that might be, about things like that. That maybe at some point they'll become something or not. But I think, and it's even within the way that I lived and we live as a family. I think it might be also a way of how I'm gonna say folklore, but it's not folklore. It's more like how people in Chile kind of do things. Like, for instance, details like if you need to fix the water in the house, you call the person that lives in your next block. You don't call this company like here in Canada that charge you more than you could have thought of, because there's a company, built for that. Or you could do it your own, you could do it yourself. Or my dad used to come and fix it, with his knowledge, or he just learned. There's a lack of resources sometimes that force you to understand or understand how things work, or forces you to find solutions. That is also DIY, and it's outside of the artistic practice, and it becomes sometimes part of your own practice or your own way of living. Yeah. Not with everything, obviously, but maybe it's part of that as well. My dad used to, had a wood studio in our backyard. So he built sometimes furniture for the house, or fix things in the house, or and I never thought of this connection sometimes, but my grandfather used to had like a printer studio in the backyard that I remember when I was in high school. I used to work with him a little bit my last year of high school, and that became a big printer of the family, of my grandfather's family in Chile, afterwards. But it all starts from a very kind of raw state sometimes. So maybe there's something about that. I don't know.
I'm seeing a connection. I'm seeing a connection.
This is the first time.
What's that?
No, because of what you mentioned, I'm seeing this connection. I never thought about this before.
Yeah. Well, it's as much as we say we're not making personal work, we can't help it.
Of course.
It's always our perspective. It's always comes from our upbringing and where we come from, and like this, these interventions that we actually bring to our space, and it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna flip through the images here. I think I'm hoping that I explained what they are, but
of course, no. And people can go to your website too if they want to kind of take a longer look at them. But you said you put this together as a book?
I did. If you scroll down here, you can see images of the book. So on 2021, I won in Canada. There's a part of the Contact Festival. There's an open call to win a grant to create a book, and I won which is called the Bertinsky Grant, and it's sponsored by Edward Bertinsky, which is a very famous Canadian photographer. So I won with this book, with Frequency, the Bertinsky Grant in 2021. And it became a book early this year. So it took me a while, but it became a book.
Congratulations!
This year.
Congratulations!
that was part of it. A very a very important push for me to make that book. And thankfully, it wasn't a big run. It was 100 copies. Thankfully, it got sold out. I think there's a couple of copies in two places. One is in Europe, in Mi Camera, in Italy, in Milan. They might have one or two copies, and they might have one or two copies at the Canadian Centre of Architecture in Montreal.
Okay.
They have a bookstore.
So if anybody wants these, they're going to have to... they're just... You got to be in Milan. Well, if they still have it. Yeah. Yeah.
You can order them online. I think there's might be one or two copies on each one of those two places, but those are the only copies. Okay. I don't think I'll print it again.
Well, here you can see the diptychs. You can see the diptychs that you were talking about, how you're putting them side by side and how you're having conversations with them. Did you design this, or did you have someone help you with it?
No, I designed this one. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah, I designed it. So there are diptychs like this or like this one over here. There's a little detail here.
Job.
But
how big is the book? Is it
the book? The size
you have
is 8 and 7.5 inches by 10 and a
like a printer paper here. Kind of size.
Yeah, I have a physical copy here with me.
There you go. So
you can see it on the screen.
Yeah.
With crisp binding and a flap.
Yeah.
And with this book, like I was also interested in kind of waste. So I'm just gonna jump into here. Like I did this 3 volumes of with all the wasted paper at the printer. Like I saw the amount of wasted paper of tests and things like that, and I basically asked them like, let's make like just 3 books and crop them randomly. I made a quick edit in 20 minutes just in one of their boardrooms and said like, okay, let's do these 3 groups, and it was, I guess, kind of a graphic design exercise to make these unique, copies. But also it's interesting how sometimes the images become something else, and the connection between them becomes something else. And I have them here with me in these 3 volumes, which are they're very, they're very.
They're big. Remind me of old phone books,
Yeah, and it's interesting how you open them up anywhere, and sometimes you see relationships that again you never thought of, or repetitions. So I like to do those little things as well that are just artist book, one edition of 1 copy, but they're important for me as part of my own process, where kind of there's a bridge between kind of photographs and the book form and graphic design. And it's part of my own kind of, as you were saying, like DIY or experimental approach, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about it is that you're thinking about a photograph as an object, and then when you start to like crop them, and it gives it new meaning, it kind of takes it to another level, which is just fascinating. You also have did you also have a sound piece that went along with this?
Yeah, so I had a solo exhibition in Chile in a gallery called Galería Animal, which is 3 rooms of the gallery. And in this room, I had like fine art prints and silver gelatin prints and big prints in newspaper that were folded and expanded. And so here's just a selection of those images, of that exhibition. But within the exhibition, I collaborate with a good friend called Justin Pape, which is one of my best friends here. And he has a studio here in Toronto on the east end of Toronto, in a building that is going to be demolished. And he works with a lot with materials, build his own materials, work a little with the sculpture and wood, and also a graphic designer, but also creates music. So he's a multidisciplinary artist. And within the pandemic, he did a record, an album of music. But also he's been doing like this little sculptures that are made of bricks of buildings that are being demolished throughout the city. There's a lot of kind of heritage buildings being demolished to create like condominiums. So there's a big problem here. And he created these little sculptures that are hosting a cassette tape on the back. That cassette tape is has I think it's 6 tracks or 10 tracks of his music that are basically sound recordings of improvisation from him playing guitar with like environmental recordings. And he invited me to collaborate with him on this limited edition run of silver gelatin prints that are being hosted within these cassette tapes. So each one of the tapes, you could buy them. I think it was an edition of 10, each one of them, with like silver gelatin prints, like paste in this sculptural hosting a cassette tape. And the sculptures themselves were like, they have this memory of like, the environment of these bricks being found on the streets, but also like, I think there's hair of Justin grown throughout the years of the pandemic, mixed with the bricks and other materials to create this kind of new material that became each one of these sculptures. Each one of them is very unique. So they're projects like this that are very kind of DIY, that have a memory aspect to it, has the memory or the elements of the city. There's a collaborative
repurposing, reusing. Yeah. That's interesting.
Of collaboration with my friend Justin, and he ended up.
The images are yours.
The photographs are mine. Are part of Frequency. Are images that were not shot within the same process, printed by me in a silver gelatin, in my darkroom, and put here into this sculpture element. And with his music. So when I had this exhibition, I asked him like if he could actually record, do a piece inspired from this cassette tape, but made into one unique audio piece that is 24 minutes and 34 seconds long, that was playing as a loop in the exhibition. So in a way, I was bringing to Chile part of that environment as well, because there's a lot of kind of sound recordings from the environment in the city here and around Ontario that is part of that. So you were looking at the photographs, and sometimes you were hearing like sounds of cities here in Ontario that became important part of the exhibition, and you can hear that here in my website as well.
I think that's if any of our audience is interested, go to his website and take a listen to that. And that's a really cool. I love it when I see artists collaborate. I have a theory that I'm not quite sure about, but I think the next big great works are not going to be solo works. They're going to be collaborations, and I love it when two worlds and two thinking come together to kind of, you're making a multimedia piece there, and I love it. It's wonderful.
No, I really like that. I don't know if I do it enough. I kind of do it enough, but like my photo practice is very solitary. But when these things happen, I think it's wonderful. Yeah,
it's exciting.
And the outcome, I don't think either of us knew exactly how the outcome was going to be. And even though everything is small runs and very independent, we're very happy with the exercise of just doing it. It's very interesting in terms of a collaboration, in terms of our own relationship, and again, great to just work with friends and have like just two different minds collaborating.
Another project that I know got my attention was Valle. So let's also take a look at that project as well. I saw a wonderful installation of that as well. So take us into that.
I came by to the Huasco project, to the Valle project. It's based on the Huasco Valley in the north of Chile. This is the southern part of the Atacama region. It's the last active valley before the driest desert in the world starts, which is the Atacama Desert. And it's the last active valley because it's one of the valleys which still has like vegetation, and the river affects the environment there. However, throughout the last 30 years, the valley has been dealing with a lot of kind of environmental, economic, and health issues that has been affecting the valley, for better or for worse, different aspects of the valley and how people live. From the border in the Andes, from the border from Chile and Argentina, to all the way to the Pacific, and in the middle as well. And I was invited to go to Huasco last year with my brother. My brother his name is Eduardo Ordóñez. He lives in Alberta, in Edmonton, here in Canada, in the Alberta region. And he's an academic from the Athabasca University. Originally a civil engineer, but his practice has been taking him to different places. And lately he's been studying what has been happening in the Atacama region, in Huasco mostly. And he was gonna travel to the valley to do surveys and interviews with different kind of people from the community. For me, it was interesting to, first of all, collaborate with him, having this, researcher point of view without me necessarily doing the research, but me getting inspired from all this data and all this research that he's been doing throughout the years about what has been happening there, and trying to interpret that through my own eyes and through photography. So we visited the Huasco Valley and went to 5 specific areas of the valley. The valley is divided by different kind of cities that go through the river, through the valley, from the Andes all the way to the Pacific. And there's a power plant that is by the coast, right in Huasco, which is one of the towns called Huasco, that has been affected with pollution. The city and how people live, and there's people that have cancer, and has been, polluted the Pacific and vegetation, and local fishermen don't have, fish anymore, etc. But all that minerals that arrive there comes from, the minings that happens in, throughout the Andes in that region. But also like all the way in the border between Argentina and Chile, there's a mining project called Pascua Lama. The Pascua side is on the Chilean side, and Lama is on the Argentinian side, and that's run by a Canadian-Chilean company. So Canada is also involved in that, and that mining project, even though it's supposed to be in pause right now, like people from the community were saying that it's not on pause anymore, that they're still like doing things there. But throughout the years, the mining project affected glaciers in the Andes, and those glaciers affected rivers, and that polluted, water, and obviously agriculture, and people that live out of that in the Andes, all the way in the hills, in the mountains. And those people are, local people, First Nations, Yaguitas, or different kind of people that work in different ways. Mind you, there's a lot of people that are in favor of this because obviously it brings economy and it brings progress to a certain extent, from my point of view, into the valley. And there's a lot of kind of activists against this. And what Eduardo and his team, and I say his team because he went with 2 civil engineers, master students from the University of Santiago of Chile. It was the 4 of us going to the valley. Eduardo was doing interviews with certain people from the communities through different kind of cities throughout the valley. The 2 students from the master program were doing surveys on the streets or in plazas in these communities. Different type of answers and questions, in terms of the survey, and the conversations that Eduardo was having was different as well, was more personalized. And I was sometimes, participating as a quiet spectator of these interviews. And many times I was just on my own, going through the environment, going through the territory, traveling with them throughout the valley, and sometimes on my own when they were spending a lot of time in one place. I took a car and just go on my own. But all the images, in a way, are a reflection of the data, the conversation, and all the research that they were that we were getting from this visit. And again, all the research from what has been happening throughout the years. So the photographs have been done in a very brief period of time. I might go back next year to do a little bit more photographs. But it's, again, a reflection of what has been happening with a very kind of subjective point of view. Is my own personal point of view, looking to, olive trees, which is one of the main agriculture kind of activities there, to how people live, to how roads have been intervened by the human intervention through companies. The presence of the state in the valley, how in a way the state, I think, has been putting more energy and more resources for roads, and selling this idea of we're building roads, we're building progress into the environments, but actually the reality is that they're actually building roads for the mining companies to actually move through the valley and destroy the valley. So that there's two ways there. Obviously, the people use the roads, etc. But around the road, you can see a lot of poverty and a lot of abandonment. So the roads, they're fixing roads and they're building, they're making, they're putting jobs for the community. But then the end result is that it's in favor of the economy of the mining companies. And most of the miners are actually, from my understanding, they're coming from outside the valley. They go on turns, they stay there for 7 days a week, and then but their family lives outside of the valley, an hour away from there, where they don't have this kind of environmental issues. And there's photographs that are very descriptive, that they're showing perhaps, a thermoelectric plant or a pig processing plant that with the carcasses of the pigs have been issues and contaminating the valleys with a smell, but also contaminated the waters years ago. Or images like this where people telling us, the pollution or the powder from the iron that flows from the trains gets into the clothes that are that we put on our backyards to hang, or in the roofs of our houses. So all that kind of black powder gets physically visible into what they smell on a day-to-day. Or, having the view from the desert towards, this pollution thermoelectric plant by the Pacific. Or, draw in the environment and how that has been affected from, climate change but also the intervention of the valley. Or abandoned, structures, because there's a lot of kind of people that have been, if there's a new company being installed into the valley, sometimes these companies go, door by door, offering money to the community for them to support this endeavor. And sometimes that's good, that's great, because they get money, but the money is never enough. And these people from the community might do an investment to put a restaurant where for 2 years you have people that are traveling through the valley, stopping there to eat, the workers. But after that, this gets abandoned. So there's a lot of structures that are in progress to being built, like this one, or a lot of structures that are just abandoned through time, because companies have been kind of have been shut down because of environmental problems, or they just broke. And sometimes, these people from the community just have death, wild nature, or how communities live, all the way in the Andes. So there's a breadth of images that kind of, for me, show the reflection. It goes along with a text that Eduardo wrote about this research, and his work on the side. He also travels to different parts of the world. I presenting this work, not necessarily with my photographs, I think, but as a whole, in a more kind of academic point of view, speaking and writing papers about it. So it has also kind of different kind of outcomes. Right now, Eduardo was in New Zealand presenting this work in an academic convention. I presented this work in an exhibition in Gaspésie, which is north of Quebec, that you can see here in a public installation, funny enough, in a bridge that looks towards a valley. So again, it's a different kind of outcome of the work that I'm interested in. It was also part of a group exhibition in Berlin early this year. And this goes along, with like public presentations of the work as, artist talks and things like that. But I'm also at the moment working with a Chilean publisher. Sorry, this exhibition is also curated by Claude Gaulet, which is the curator, the art director of the Gaspésie Photo Festival in Gaspésie. And I'm also, as I was saying, I'm also working with a Chilean publisher to hopefully, depending on a grant from the Chilean government, create a book next year in Chile with this photo publisher from Chile. For me, it's important for this book to, have a voice and be represented in Chile rather than actually publish it here, because again, it's about Chile and for Chile.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and we created a little book with Eduardo that shows some of the images and information and data information from the results from all that survey. And this book was a small edition, basically for us to give back to the community that we sent back to the people that we interviewed, and in a way give a little bit of that information that we're gathering or that we are creating through photographs back to the community. So things like that also have been important part of this project.
I was in a previous conversation earlier this week with somebody in Montana, and they were talking about the extraction industry and how they that there's a complex relationship, and you referenced it a little bit with the community around. So it brings in money, but it also affects the land in a very profound way. And you referenced that complexity. Kind of talk to me a little bit about that. I'm curious because you kind of said it right at the beginning of this. You're like, there's some people that are for it, some people that are against it. Like, where have you gotten with that?
I mean, it's very understandable, the different kind of points of view. And this is a reality that is not just from Huasco. At least in Chile, it's reflected throughout different parts of the country. Like you see it in the coast, in the Central Valley, you see it in the north, you see it in the south with like salmon companies, or like where the rainforests are, like how wood has been abstracted or removed from the environment, So, and that happens here in Canada. It happens in British Columbia, with wood. It happens, in areas where the First Nations are, like it happens in many countries. It's a common thing that, so what's happening here is also kind of a metaphor to other places. It could be reflected in different places. And so when we were there, sometimes I cannot speak about this because of because it's not necessarily my interviews of my research. It's Eduardo's, and it's part of the university. So, but I was part of some of the interviews with people that were in favor and people that were against that, and First Nations activists. And some of the reasons were like they lost family members because of cancer, and because of the water was polluted, and how that affected their children, because for a period of time they didn't want to drink water because they were afraid, or they didn't want to shower because they were afraid, I think, or how people have to move away from towns like Wasco to live in a more in a settlement, in a bus, because they didn't have resources to actually have a house, but they didn't want to live in this area that was completely polluted. So there's kind of a violence happening from the states and from these companies towards how people live. That is very, very difficult. And I think, from my point of view, and this is very personal from my point of view, I'm not talking as a team, again, because there's politics involved in terms of, the organizations and the universities and all that. From my point of view, that affects me more, than having enough economy, or having a good job, or because they talk, like, for instance, these companies or the state, they talk about progress, right? Oh, we're going to build better roads, or we're going to put a better school, and then they leave, and sometimes speaking with like people there, they say like, I have everything, like I'm not a rich person, in terms of money, and they live in these beautiful adobe houses. But they say like, we have everything that we want here. Like when they talk about progress for us, we don't really understand what progress is. We used to live with like a very natural environment, free of pollution, where we can grow our vegetables. So we have a really quiet life that we can live with our door open all day, and there's no violence, there's no, et cetera, et cetera. So their quality of life is measured not by economy,
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
And it's hard to understand where the balance is, because that
it is.
Obviously, none of us, we don't live in the same way. We don't like to live in the same way, but to live as a community, we need to be able to create a balance. And sometimes that balance, or many times that balance has been it doesn't exist, and things are forced into other people. Again, there's images like this one where this is a pig processing plant that is supposedly on hold, and that is in the middle of the valley, that it affected the valley in different kind of ways with pollution and bad smells, etc. But there's more kind of abstract or metaphorical images like this one, that speak about the plants or the environment or the valley itself. So in most of my images, there's a lot of kind of lines, from the cable lines to the train lines, and this idea of connection visually as a valley, but also this idea of connection for them to feel disconnected from opportunities, to being left behind by the state, but also like the connection of the train tracks and how that, the pollution has been kind of coming from the mountains all the way to the ocean, in terms of connection, in terms of things being distributed, or the pollution being distributed through the valley, that became important, and that in a way it's a visual connection that is happening through the images, like what you see here, and that is very very subtle, and it wasn't conscious. But it's still there, in different ways. But yeah, like there's images that are more abstract. I like sometimes where images are very to the point and they're easy to understand, but you have some other images in between that a little bit more abstract, or create certain amount of tension perhaps into an edit. And that's what I normally hopefully try to do. I'm hoping to be successful in that at some points.
With that last project, you had one project that was, I hate calling it subdued, but it was, etheric, it was contemplative. And then this one, which is very subject driven. It's very location driven. It's about our presence on the world. And I'm kind of curious, the impact of this last one on you. Did it have an impact on you? A lingering one, maybe?
It it definitely did. In different ways. I was aware, for instance, of what was happening there, because again, it's been happening and it's on the news here with local things, but also throughout Chile. But I was never in those places looking, at what was happening or what has been happening, or talking to the people. So that really affected me.
Because like I've noticed this, photographers, we are a product of our attention. So whatever we put attention to, a lot of times we have this feeling, and then all of a sudden we take an image. But that attention has a price to it. And I've noticed that with a lot of people that take on projects like this one, that there's a price to be paid. Would you agree to that?
And what do you mean by a price to be paid? In what sense?
It affects us.
Oh yeah,
it affects us. Like there's a lingering for paying attention.
Yeah, and yeah, it does. It does. I still don't know in what way exactly. Perhaps. Yeah. I've noticed that after this project, it's been harder for me to start something else, and before I was more. I used to shoot a lot just for the sake of shooting, and that's why I've been forcing myself to do that this year a little bit more. Yeah. And I'm not sure if it's because of the importance of this topic, and that I had a researcher working with me, which is something that I didn't have before. I think maybe that's part of it. And it's not that, if I do a project on my own, it's not important, but somehow in my head, it feels like that. Obviously it's harder to express something, on your own.
Sometimes. Sure. Absolutely.
But this definitely became very important. Mind you, I'm also very, I want to be very conscious and very, I don't want to say political, but, being careful of everything that I say, because it's not necessarily I'm a Chilean, and this obviously affects me because I have people there and etc. And I go back to there, and I plan to go back at some point to live again to Chile. But I'm also living far away. So somehow I'm looking at this from the outside. And I want to be very, respectful with the people that live there, because it's their environment, and I feel that it's like, who am I to actually go there, take photos, and tell their story? And I took a few portraits, but those portraits are not part of the project. I think I will need to spend a lot of time to actually make those portraits be those people be the voice of the project. I want to be very conscious and very respectful that this is my point of view of that data. That is very, as engineers, the data is very to the point, by numbers. And that affected with the things that I saw and the conversations, the dialogues that we had with the local people, my own interpretation. So it's not necessarily a documentary project. It has aspects of documentary. And why I say that, because I also feel, again, that it's my own interpretation, it's subjective, based on this data, informed by this data.
The thoughtfulness comes across. It comes across. And I think you did a great job representing that. And so I have one last question for you. Mm-hmm. It's the one that I ask everyone. And we have a lot of people that follow this show that are image makers themselves, people that are exploring photography and trying to get their feet wet in that world and start to kind of, get in there. And so do you have any advice for anybody that's an image maker coming up right now?
I don't like to give. I don't know if I have an advice. I try to find advices for me as well. I would just say, just try things, without without thinking too much, just try, again, going back to the DIY thing, Just try, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes. And sometimes you're not gonna get any learning right away. Maybe that learning you'll realize afterwards. It's the idea of doing, the idea of practicing. I think is very important. Things don't happen like this right away, and there's like years where everything might feel that are working, and there's like dry periods of time as well. Like right now, I feel that I'm going through a dry period, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like I'm just like looking and thinking, and I have no idea what the next thing is that I'm going to be doing. I'm doing a project with an organization in Italy, but it's a long-term project, so it's still that also still it's on pause in a way. I have to wait a few months, etc., etc. So there's things happening, but I haven't shot in a few months. I don't know what to shoot, and that's okay. It
happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
It happens. Like I think we're used to, again, as you were framing this conversation at the beginning, we're used to a lot of images. We're used to a lot of things happening constantly, and we push ourselves to always be active. And sometimes being active means I do these little sketchbooks where I take notes, and sometimes being active is just this, it doesn't mean that you need to do work and be exhibiting all the time. That's going to drive you to something at some point. Yeah, I think.
Well, you said you don't like to give advice, but I think that was good advice. I think you did a good job. So once again, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully it will communicate fine.
And to everyone that has joined us this long, thank you so much for being on the ride today. And if you like content like this, please consider liking, sharing, and commenting. That all helps us with the algorithm and gets new people to the content like this. And of course, if you want to support content like this, think about becoming a member on our Patreon. We would love to have you there. And as always, we'll see you next time.